The sun had barely risen over the picturesque country landscape, but already the shrill sound of Karen's voice pierced the morning calm. As she stormed across the lush, rolling fields toward the small farmhouse, her eyes blazed with fury, a vein pulsing in her temple. This was war, and she was determined to emerge victorious, no matter the cost. Karen's perfectly manicured nails drummed impatiently on the pristine white fence as she glared at the farmhouse. How dare these people disturb the sanctity of her meticulously maintained neighborhood with their unkempt land and unsightly livestock? As the president of the Homeowners Association, it was her duty to uphold the community standards, and she would stop at nothing to ensure compliance. "This is unacceptable," she shrieked, her shrill voice cutting through the morning air. "Those animals are a nuisance, and that fence is an eyesore. I've tried being reasonable, but now I'm done playing nice." The farmhouse door creaked open, and a weary-looking man emerged, wiping the sleep from his eyes. "Ma'am, is there a problem?" he asked, his voice laced with patience. "Problem? Of course, there's a problem." Karen spat, her eyes narrowing. "Your farm is an absolute disgrace, and it's dragging down the entire neighborhood. I've had enough. I'm calling the authorities, and you're going to be fined until you fix this mess." The man's brow furrowed, and he took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "Ma'am, this is my family's land, and we've been farming here for generations. We take pride in our work and our animals. I'm afraid I can't just simply fix what you consider a problem." Karen's lips curled into a triumphant sneer. "Oh, we'll see about that," she hissed, pulling out her phone and jabbing at the screen. "Hello, 911. Yes, I need to report a code violation at the property on Elm Street. The owners are refusing to comply with the HOA regulations, and their animals are causing a disturbance. Yes, I need an officer out here immediately." As Karen waited, a small crowd began to gather, drawn by the commotion. The farmer's wife, a kind-looking woman with weathered hands, stepped forward, her brow furrowed in concern. "Ma'am, please, there's no need for this," she pleaded. "We're not causing any harm. Our animals are well cared for, and we do our best to be good neighbors." Karen scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "I don't care about your excuses. The rules are the rules, and you're breaking them. Now, where are those officers?" The farmer's wife opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the sound of sirens pierced the air, and a police car came barreling down the dirt road, its lights flashing. Karen's face lit up with triumph, but the smile quickly faded as the officer stepped out of the vehicle, his expression stern. "Ma'am, what seems to be the problem here?" the officer asked, striding over to where Karen stood, her phone still clutched in her hand. Karen straightened her shoulders, her chin held high. "Officer, these people are blatantly disregarding the HOA regulations. Their farm is an eyesore, and their animals are a nuisance. I demand that you issue them a citation and fine them immediately." The officer's gaze shifted from Karen to the farmer and his wife, his expression softening. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I can't issue a citation without a valid reason. These people appear to be good, law-abiding citizens, and I see no evidence of any violations. If you have a legitimate concern, I'd be happy to investigate, but I won't be issuing any fines or citations today." Karen's face flushed with indignation, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But, this is an outrage. I'm the president of the HOA, and I demand that you do something." The officer raised a hand, silencing her. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down and return to your own property. If you continue to harass these residents, I may have to consider issuing you a citation for disturbing the peace. Now, I suggest you go home and let these good people get back to their work." As the officer turned and walked back to his car, Karen stood there, her mouth agape, her face a mask of pure fury. The farmer and his wife exchanged a relieved glance, and the small crowd erupted into applause, their faces alight with triumph. Karen stood there, seething, as the crowd dispersed and the officer drove away. Her perfectly coiffed hair had fallen slightly out of place, and her nails had left angry crescents in the palms of her hands. She couldn't believe that her plan had backfired so spectacularly. Fuming, she stomped back to her pristine, cookie-cutter house, slamming the door behind her. Once inside, she paced the immaculate living room, her mind racing. How dare that farmer and his wife defy her? Didn't they understand that she was the one in charge here? She sank into her plush, leather armchair, her brow furrowed in thought. There had to be another way to get what she wanted. She couldn't just let this go. Her reputation as the HOA president was on the line. Suddenly, a devious smile spread across her face as a plan began to take shape. The next morning, Karen emerged from her house, a stack of papers clutched in her hand. She marched back to the farmhouse, her stride determined, and knocked on the door. When the farmer's wife answered, Karen put on her most saccharine smile. "Good morning, my dear," she cooed, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm so sorry about the misunderstanding yesterday. I was just trying to do my job as the HOA president, but I can see now that I may have gone a bit overboard." The farmer's wife eyed her warily, her lips pressed into a thin line. "What do you want, Karen?" Karen's smile didn't waver. "Well, I was hoping we could start fresh. I've compiled a list of all the HOA regulations that I believe your farm is in violation of. If you could just sign these forms agreeing to make the necessary changes, I'd be more than happy to let this whole thing blow over." The farmer's wife hesitated, her gaze flicking down to the papers in Karen's outstretched hand. "I'm not sure I'm comfortable signing anything without having a lawyer look it over first." Karen's smile tightened, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Oh, my dear, I assure you these are just standard forms. Nothing to worry about. I simply want to help you bring your property up to code and avoid any further issues with the HOA." The farmer's wife frowned, her brow furrowing in concern. "I don't know, Karen. I'm not sure we can afford to make all the changes you're requesting. And frankly, I'm not comfortable signing anything without fully understanding what it entails." Karen's patience was wearing thin, and she leaned in, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "Listen, my dear, I'm trying to help you here. If you don't sign these forms, I'll have no choice but to report you to the city. You'll be fined, and who knows what other consequences you might face. But if you cooperate, I can make all of this go away. It's really in your best interest to just sign and get it over with." The farmer's wife hesitated, her eyes darting from the papers to Karen's face and back again. Finally, with a resigned sigh, she reached out and took the papers, her hand trembling slightly. "Wonderful," Karen exclaimed, clapping her hands together. "I knew you'd see it my way. Just sign at the bottom, and we'll get this all sorted out." The farmer's wife paused, her pen poised above the dotted line. "I really think I should have my lawyer look this over first," she murmured, her voice uncertain. Karen's smile faltered, and her eyes narrowed. Now, my dear, there's no need for all that. I assure you, these are perfectly standard forms. Just sign, and we can put this whole unpleasant business behind us." The farmer's wife hesitated for a moment longer, then slowly began to sign her name on the dotted line. As she did so, a deep sense of unease settled in the pit of her stomach. Something about this just didn't feel right. As the farmer's wife reluctantly signed the forms, a sense of dread washed over her. Something about the way Karen was pressuring her felt deeply unsettling, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Once the papers were signed, Karen snatched them back, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "Wonderful, my dear. I knew you'd see reason. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to get these filed with the city." The farmer's wife watched helplessly as Karen strode back to her car, her heels clicking against the gravel driveway. Something was off, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a grave mistake. Later that day, the farmer and his wife sat at their worn kitchen table, their faces etched with worry. "I don't like this, Jed," the farmer's wife said, her voice trembling. "I've got a bad feeling about those papers Karen made me sign." Jed, the farmer, reached across the table and squeezed his wife's hand. "I know, darlin', but we can't undo it now. All we can do is keep our heads down and hope Karen sticks to her word." But Karen had no intention of sticking to her word. As soon as she had filed the papers with the city, she began making phone calls, pulling in every favor she could. Within a week, the city had dispatched a team of inspectors to the farm, citing numerous violations and slapping the family with an astronomical fine. When the inspectors arrived, the farmer's wife went pale, her hands shaking as she tried to explain the situation. "But we haven't changed anything," she pleaded. "We've been farming this land for generations, and we've always been good neighbors. This can't be right." The lead inspector, a stern-faced man with a clipboard, shook his head. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but these are the regulations. You've got 30 days to bring your property up to code or face further penalties. If you can't pay the fine, we'll have no choice but to shut you down." As the inspectors left, the farmer's wife crumpled to the ground, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Jed pulled her into his arms, his own eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know what we're going to do, darlin'," he whispered. "We don't have that kind of money. We're going to lose everything." Meanwhile, Karen sat in her immaculate living room, a smug smile plastered across her face. She had finally emerged victorious, and the thought of the farmer and his wife losing their beloved farm filled her with a twisted sense of satisfaction. She had won, and that was all that mattered. But as the days passed, the farmer and his wife worked tirelessly, selling off what they could and taking out loans in a desperate attempt to pay the hefty fine. They scraped together every penny, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion. Finally, the day of the deadline arrived, and the farmer and his wife stood nervously in front of the city inspector, their hands clasped tightly together. "We've managed to pay the fine, sir," Jed said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we had to sell off half our livestock and most of our equipment to do it. I don't know how we're going to keep the farm running after this." The inspector studied the paperwork, his brow furrowed. "Well, I'll be," he murmured, shaking his head. "It seems everything is in order. I'm afraid I have no choice but to sign off on this." The farmer and his wife exchanged a relieved glance, their faces breaking into weary smiles. They had managed to save their farm, but at what cost? As they walked back to their home, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. Karen, her arms crossed and a triumphant expression on her face. "Well, well, well," she purred, her voice dripping with venom. "It looks like you managed to scrape together the money after all. I must say, I'm impressed. But tell me, how does it feel to have lost half your livestock and equipment just to keep this place running?" The farmer's wife felt a surge of anger, her hands clenching into fists. "This is all your fault, Karen," she cried, her voice shaking with emotion. "You used your position to manipulate the system and nearly destroy us. How can you live with yourself?" Karen's smile only widened, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Oh, my dear, I'm just doing my job as the HOA president. It's not my fault you couldn't follow the rules. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some more important matters to attend to." As Karen turned and walked away, the farmer and his wife stood there, their hearts heavy with the weight of their loss. They had survived this battle, but the war was far from over. The sun had long set over the farmhouse, but sleep eluded the exhausted couple. Jed and his wife, Sarah, sat at the kitchen table, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion. "I just don't understand it, Jed," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "How can one person be so cruel? We've done nothing wrong, and yet we've lost half our livestock and equipment just to keep this place running." Jed reached across the table and grasped his wife's hand, his calloused fingers enveloping her delicate ones. "I know, darling, but we can't give up now. This farm has been in our family for generations, and we're not going to let that witch take it from us." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and she squeezed Jed's hand tightly. "But what are we going to do, Jed? We barely have enough money to keep the farm going as it is. And if Karen decides to come after us again, I don't think we'll be able to survive it." Jed's brow furrowed, and he leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "Well, we've got to find a way to fight back. That woman's got to have a weakness somewhere, and we're gonna find it." As the first rays of dawn filtered through the kitchen window, Jed and Sarah set to work, determined to uncover Karen's Achilles heel. They pored over old records, scoured the internet, and even reached out to their neighbors, all in a desperate attempt to find a way to stop Karen's relentless crusade. Days turned into weeks, and their efforts seemed fruitless. Karen continued to flex her power, using her position on the HOA to make their lives a living hell. She orchestrated countless inspections, each one resulting in hefty fines that the couple could barely afford. Just when they were about to give up, a glimmer of hope emerged. One of their neighbors, a kind-hearted older woman named Mrs. Wilkins, approached them with a surprising revelation. "You know, I've been doing some digging of my own," Mrs. Wilkins said, her voice low and conspiratorial. "And it seems that Karen's position on the HOA may not be as secure as she thinks." Jed and Sarah exchanged a puzzled glance, leaning in closer. "What do you mean?" Jed asked, his brow furrowed. Mrs. Wilkins lowered her voice even further, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Well, it seems that Karen has been skimming funds from the HOA for her own personal use. I've got proof, and I'm willing to share it with you, if you're willing to take this fight to the next level." Jed and Sarah's eyes widened, and they sat in stunned silence for a moment. The possibility of finally taking down their tormentor was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Mrs. Wilkins, are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, going up against Karen, especially with something like this, it could get messy." Mrs. Wilkins nodded solemnly. "I understand your hesitation, but this is the only way to stop her. Karen needs to be held accountable for her actions, and if we don't do it, no one will." Jed and Sarah exchanged a long, thoughtful look, their minds racing. Finally, Jed spoke, his voice firm and resolute. "All right, Mrs. Wilkins, we're in. Let's take this witch down." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity for Jed, Sarah, and Mrs. Wilkins as they prepared to take down Karen once and for all. Armed with the damning evidence of her financial misdeeds, they began to carefully orchestrate their plan. First, they reached out to the other members of the HOA, carefully sharing the information they had uncovered. One by one, the skeptical homeowners began to see the truth, their trust in Karen's leadership rapidly crumbling. "I can't believe she's been stealing from us all this time," exclaimed one of the neighbors, his face flushed with outrage. "We need to call an emergency meeting and put an end to this." The momentum was building, and Jed and Sarah could feel the tide starting to turn in their favor. But they knew that Karen would not go down without a fight, and they had to be prepared for her inevitable backlash. As the emergency HOA meeting was called, the tension in the air was palpable. Karen, her perfectly coiffed hair and immaculate makeup, strode into the room, her chin held high. But the confident facade began to crack as the other members confronted her with the evidence. "Karen, what is the meaning of this?" demanded one of the homeowners, waving a stack of financial records in the air. "These documents clearly show that you've been embezzling funds from the HOA. How could you do this to us?" Karen's eyes widened, and her composure began to slip. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice uncharacteristically shaky. "Those records must be forged. I would never do such a thing." But the more the homeowners pressed her, the more Karen's defenses crumbled. Sweat beaded on her brow, and her hands trembled as she tried to defend herself. It was a stark contrast to the confident, controlling woman they had all come to fear. Jed and Sarah watched the scene unfold, their hearts pounding with a mixture of triumph and trepidation. They knew that this was only the beginning, and that Karen would stop at nothing to regain her power. As the meeting dragged on, the other HOA members debated the appropriate course of action. Some advocated for a formal investigation, while others argued for Karen's immediate removal. The air was thick with tension, and the outcome hung in the balance. Finally, the president of the HOA called for a vote. One by one, the members cast their ballots, their faces set with determination. When the votes were tallied, the verdict was clear. Karen was to be removed from her position as president, effective immediately. A hush fell over the room as Karen's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her carefully crafted facade had crumbled, and she was left exposed, her misdeeds laid bare for all to see. As the other homeowners filed out of the room, Jed and Sarah approached Karen, their eyes filled with a mix of pity and satisfaction. "It's over, Karen," Jed said, his voice low and measured. "You've lost, and we're not going to let you hurt us or our farm ever again." Karen's lips trembled, and she averted her gaze, her pride finally broken. Jed and Sarah exchanged a long, silent look, their hearts heavy with the weight of their victory. They knew that the battle was far from over, but for now, they had won. The aftermath of Karen's removal from the HOA was both cathartic and unsettling for Jed and Sarah. On one hand, they felt a sense of relief that their tormentor had finally been stripped of her power. But on the other, they couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was merely the calm before the storm. In the days that followed, the couple watched as Karen's formerly loyal supporters began to distance themselves, their trust in her shattered. The once pristine neighborhood suddenly seemed to lose its luster, as if the very air had been tainted by the revelation of Karen's misdeeds. Jed and Sarah, however, were focused on the task at hand, repairing the damage that Karen's relentless campaign had inflicted on their beloved farm. With the HOA fines lifted and their livestock and equipment slowly being replaced, they could finally breathe a sigh of relief. But just as they were starting to settle back into their familiar routines, a knock at the door shattered the fragile peace. Jed and Sarah exchanged a wary glance before Jed moved to answer it, his heart pounding. To their surprise, it was Mrs. Wilkins, her face etched with concern. "Jed, Sarah, I'm so sorry to bother you, but I think you need to see this," she said, her voice trembling. Stepping aside, she revealed a stack of official-looking documents in her hands. Jed took them, his brow furrowing as he quickly scanned the pages. Suddenly, his eyes widened, and he let out a low, guttural curse. "What is it, Jed?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with worry. "It's a lawsuit," Jed said, his jaw clenched. "Karen's suing us for defamation and damaging her reputation." Sarah's face paled, and she reached out a shaky hand to take the documents from Jed. As she read through them, her heart sank. The charges were serious, and the financial implications were staggering. "We can't afford this, Jed," she whispered, her voice quivering. "We barely have enough to keep the farm running as it is. How are we going to fight this?" Jed pulled his wife into a tight embrace, his own fear and uncertainty threatening to overwhelm him. "I don't know, darling," he murmured, "but we've got to try. We can't let that witch take everything we've worked for." As the days turned into weeks, Jed and Sarah found themselves consumed by the legal battle, their every waking moment spent poring over documents and preparing their defense. The financial strain was immense, and they were forced to dip into their meager savings just to keep up with the mounting legal fees. Meanwhile, Karen seemed to revel in their suffering, her cold, calculating gaze following their every move. She had lost the HOA, but now she was determined to crush them completely, to rob them of everything they held dear. Exhausted and overwhelmed, Jed and Sarah began to wonder if they had bitten off more than they could chew. The prospect of losing their beloved farm, their very way of life, hung over them like a dark cloud, threatening to extinguish the last glimmer of hope they had. But even as the odds seemed to stack against them, Jed and Sarah refused to give up. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to let Karen win. And with the support of their neighbors, including the steadfast Mrs. Wilkins, they vowed to fight this battle to the bitter end. The courtroom was a cauldron of tension as Jed and Sarah sat across from Karen, their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. The air was thick with the weight of the proceedings, the financial and emotional stakes higher than they had ever imagined. Karen, her once flawless composure now a thin veneer, sat with her back round straight, her lips curled into a bitter sneer. Her legal team, a formidable array of seasoned attorneys, presented their case with practiced precision, painting Jed and Sarah as vengeful, untrustworthy liars. But Jed and Sarah were not about to go down without a fight. With the steadfast support of Mrs. Wilkins and the other homeowners, they had painstakingly compiled a mountain of evidence, exposing the truth of Karen's financial misdeeds and her relentless campaign to destroy their family's farm. As the trial wore on, the courtroom became a stage for a war of attrition, with both sides volleying accusations and counterclaims, each determined to emerge victorious. Jed and Sarah poured their hearts and souls into their defense, their voices shaking with emotion as they recounted the hardships they had endured. But Karen, her desperation palpable, refused to back down. She hurled insults and threats, her eyes burning with a cold, calculating rage. She was determined to crush Jed and Sarah, to make them pay for daring to challenge her. And then, just when it seemed that the scales of justice might tip in Karen's favor, a surprise witness took the stand. Mrs. Wilkins, her face etched with a quiet determination. With a steady voice, the elderly woman laid bare the truth, meticulously recounting the evidence she had gathered and the trail of financial irregularities that led directly to Karen's doorstep. The courtroom fell silent as the damning testimony unfolded, and even the judge seemed visibly shaken by the revelations. Karen, her facade finally shattering, descended into a frantic tirade, her shrill voice echoing through the chamber. But her desperate attempts to discredit Mrs. Wilkins and cast doubt on the evidence fell on deaf ears. As the judge's gavel fell, signaling the end of the proceedings, Jed and Sarah held their breath, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The verdict would determine the fate of their beloved farm, their very way of life. The judge's words, when they came, were a symphony of justice and retribution. Karen was found guilty on all charges, her actions deemed a flagrant abuse of power and a breach of the public trust. The hefty fines and restitution ordered were a staggering blow, one that would cripple her financially and strip her of the wealth and status she had so desperately clung to. As Karen was led away, her face contorted with a mix of shock and disbelief, Jed and Sarah felt a weight lift from their shoulders. The nightmare was finally over, and they had emerged victorious, their farm and their integrity intact. But as they embraced, a bittersweet realization dawned on them. The cost of their triumph had been high, and they knew that the scars of this ordeal would linger for years to come. Still, they were determined to move forward, to rebuild and reclaim the life they had fought so hard to protect. In the months that followed the trial, Jed and Sarah found themselves in a state of cautious optimism. The victory over Karen had been hard won, but it had also come at a great personal and financial cost. The legal fees had drained their savings, and the stress of the ordeal had taken a heavy toll on their well-being. Yet, as they surveyed the rolling fields and tended to their beloved livestock, they couldn't help but feel a sense of renewed pride and purpose. The farm, once under threat, now stood as a symbol of their resilience and determination. They had weathered the storm, and they were more determined than ever to preserve their way of life. With the help of their loyal neighbors, including the steadfast Mrs. Wilkins, Jed and Sarah set about the task of rebuilding and restoring their farm to its former glory. They worked tirelessly, their hands calloused and their spirits renewed, as they slowly but surely replaced the livestock and equipment they had been forced to sell. As the seasons changed and the years passed, the scars of their battle with Karen began to fade, replaced by a sense of hard-won peace and contentment. The once pristine neighborhood had undergone a transformation of its own. with the homeowners banding together to create a new, more inclusive community, one that valued diversity and celebrated the unique character of each property. And as for Karen, she had been forced to face the consequences of her actions. Stripped of her position on the HOA and ordered to make restitution, she was a shadow of her former self, her once formidable presence diminished to a mere whisper. The community she had once sought to control had turned against her, a testament to the power of collective action and the triumph of justice. For Jed and Sarah, the ordeal had been a harrowing one, but it had also forged in them a deeper appreciation for the things that truly mattered: family, community, and the indomitable spirit of the land they called home. As they watched their children and grandchildren play among the fields, their hearts swelled with a profound sense of gratitude and renewal. The farm, once under threat, had become a beacon of hope, a living testament to the power of perseverance and the unbreakable bonds of a family who refused to be defeated. And as they looked towards the future, Jed and Sarah knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, their roots firmly planted in the soil they had fought so hard to protect.